everyone, and welcome to today's video. My name is Alan and I'm a verbal trainer in the Kenya Airlift Program. In today's video, we are going to be covering modifiers. Modifiers are a critical part of sentence correction, which is one of the three major sections in GMAT verbal, the other two being reading comprehension and critical reasoning. So today you're going to be seeing what modifiers are all about. So what are modifiers? Modifiers essentially are phrases or clauses or words that provide additional information about the sentence core. So they can be adjectives or they can be dependent clauses. A dependent clause essentially is a part of a sentence that does not have a working verb. So it cannot stand alone as a complete sentence, hence it's a dependent clause. It has to be coupled either with an independent clause so that it can stand on its own to form a complete sentence. So modifiers often start with subordinating conjunctions such as although, and the sentence core that we'll be referring to here, it comprises of independent clauses along with essential modifiers. So when this sentence core is combined with a modifier or a dependent clause, it comprises a complex sentence, and then the sentence gives more information or gives more meaning regarding the subject. So an example of a modifier is in this particular sentence. Although she didn't have much work experience, she was offered the job. That's a complex sentence. It has two parts. If I'm just going to illustrate here a bit, the first part of this is a dependent clause, which comprises our modifier. So although she didn't have much work experience, that's our modifier, which essentially is also our which is essentially a dependent clause. If you look at this particular first part of the sentence before the comma, although she didn't have much work experience, it cannot stand alone as a complete sentence because there's no working verb there. We don't know. So you as the reader, you're left with the question. So what? She did not have much work experience, so she was offered the job. So essentially, what this modifier does, it gives you extra information. It gives you information regarding the circumstances in which this particular subject or this particular individual was offered the job, and the particular circumstances are that she did not have much work experience. And then your sentence core then will be she was offered the job, because now this encompasses the main action that affects this particular subject. She was offered the job under which circumstances or under what circumstances she did not have much work experience. And as we can see in our modifier here, which is essentially the clause on the left-hand side of the comma, it starts with a coordinating conjunction in this case. So the modifier, although she did have much work experience, gives more information on the circumstances in which this particular subject was offered the job. So modifiers comprise two types. We have essential and non-essential modifiers. Essential modifiers are necessary in order to understand the meaning of the sentence, while non-essential modifiers are not critical to the meaning of the sentence. So how to differentiate these two types of modifiers, and we're going to see examples shortly. Non-essential modifiers are usually separated out from the rest of the sentences, or rather from the rest of the sentence using commas, while essential modifiers are not separated by commas. So let's see how these two types of modifiers are employed in sentences. So what you need to note, which is used for non-essential modifiers, and whenever you have which used in a sentence, it is usually offset from the rest of the sentence using a comma, as we're going to see, while that is used in essential modifiers. So in this particular example that follows, it shows the respective applications of which and that for non-essential and essential modifiers respectively. So, for example, the example reads, turn left on Mayberry Street and stop at the first house, which is red. So in this particular sentence, as it is written, so the meaning here is that the first house on Mayberry Street is red. So essentially what this modifier does, of course, the modifier is what is after the comma, and we said which is used for non-essential modifiers. And in this case, or in all cases, non-essential modifiers are offset using commas. So turn left on Mayberry Street and stop at the first house, which is red. Essentially, you can rewrite this sentence and say, turn left on Mayberry Street and turn at the first house. That would be sufficient to would give sufficient information to the recipient of this particular information as to where they are supposed to stop, or that would give sufficient direction. So essentially what this means, if you were to diagram it, if Mayberry Street, of course, it's a left turn. So if this is your main road and Mayberry Street is here, so the first house on Mayberry Street is red. So that's what this particular sentence means. As opposed to the second sentence, which states, turn left on Mayberry Street and stop at the first house that is red. So in this case, what this particular sentence means, the first house on Mayberry Street may not necessarily be red. It could be gray, it could be blue, but you as the recipient of this information are supposed to stop at the first red house. So if what sentence 2 means is that if this is the main street and this is Mayberry Street, then you have a couple of houses maybe in a block. So maybe if house number 1 is blue or say gray, and then house number 2 probably is red, just for illustrative purposes. So essentially you're supposed to stop at house number 2. So, and stop at the first house that is red. So that's essential. That information is essential to understanding the meaning of this particular sentence. So as illustrated by this particular example, that is used for essential modifiers, and which is used for non-essential modifiers. And essential modifiers are critical to understanding the meaning of the sentence, whereas non-essential modifiers, as the name suggests, are not critical to understanding the meaning of the sentence. So another thing to note is that which modifies nouns, while ing modifiers modify actions. So that's another main point for which you should note, and an example is as illustrated here. For example, crime has recently decreased in our neighborhood, leading to a rise in property values. So this is an adverbial modifier, or essentially what adverbial modifiers are. They modify actions or adjectives. Of course, the assumption of this particular lesson is that you know the basic parts of speech, you know what an adverb is, what an adjective is, and what a verb is. So that will not be covered within the scope of this lesson. The onus is upon you to do more research into the basic parts of speech if you still have a problem with that. So in this particular example that is showing adverbial modifier, crime has recently decreased in our neighborhood, leading to a rise in property values. So of course, leading to a rise in property values is your modifier in this case. So it shows additional information about this particular sentence. So it shows the consequence of the decrease in crime in our in this particular neighborhood. So it modifies the decrease in crime in this particular neighborhood, and not necessarily a specific thing or a specific noun, as opposed to the second sentence, which reads, the box of nails, which is nearly full, belongs to Jean. So here you have a noun modifier in this, which is nearly full. So this particular modifier modifies the box of nails, right? So it modifies a specific thing. In this case, you have a noun modifier, and what you have here is an unessential modifier, which is offset by commas. So as we have seen, those are the two respective applications of adverbial and noun modifiers, as well as essential and non-essential modifiers in their different contexts. So we are going to look at noun and adverbial modifiers to a greater extent. So for example, or rather, a main point to note here is that noun modifiers can include adjectives, which modify only a noun or a pronoun. So of course, we said modifiers could be adjectives, they could be dependent clauses. So in this case, adjectives also qualify as noun modifiers, because if say you're describing a thing, say the big dog jumped over the fence, say, so the word big, there would be an adjective that is describing the dog. So that would be a noun modifier essentially. Secondly, adverbial modifiers, they include adverbs and can modify verbs, adjectives, prepositional phrases, and even entire clauses, but they do not modify plain nouns. So that's the main difference between noun and adverbial modifiers. Noun modifiers modify nouns only. Adverbial modifiers modify everything else apart from nouns. So whenever a sentence begins with a modifying phrase that's followed by a comma, the noun or pronoun right after the comma should be what the phrase is referring to. So these are very important principle when it comes to modifiers and essentially it makes up the core or the bulk of what modifier error questions test in sentence correction, as we're going to see later on in this presentation and maybe in our subsequent videos. So non-modifier markers include which, were, when, that, who, were, those, and whom. So those are just examples. Like in the previous examples, we were referring to the box of nails, which is nearly full. So in this case, your marker for the noun modifier would be which, because it modifies the box of nails. So another thing to note about modifiers, they are also indicated by subordinating conjunctions such as although. So we already mentioned that. Now we are going to see, this is the main principle that you should note. Whenever a sentence begins with the modifying phrase that's followed by a comma, the noun or pronoun right after the comma should be what the phrase is referring to. We are going to see at that particular principle in application shortly.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstack America. Upstack America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstackamerica.com. Upstack America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential within you.
So more on noun and adverbial modifiers. So the principle, place a noun and its modifier as close together as the sentence allows. And this is an extension of the principle that we highlighted previously, that whenever a sentence begins with a modifying phrase that's followed by a comma, the noun or pronoun right after the comma should be what the phrase is referring to. So in this particular example, we see that particular principle in application. So the sentence reads, a hard worker and a loyal team player. The new project was managed by Sue. So essentially, this particular sentence is wrong because, as we said, the noun, or rather the modifier, the noun should be as close to the modifier as possible. So once you see as a compound sentence like this or a complex sentence, your first question would be, where is the modifier? And the modifier in this case would be the first part of this particular sentence, a hard worker and a loyal team player. So these are adjectives or a combination of adjectives or adjective of phrase that is being used to describe somebody in this case, right? And now your question would be, what is this adjective of phrase, or who is this adjective of phrase describing? And your answer to that particular question would be, it's Sue. So Sue should be as close to the subject. Sue should be as close to the modifier as possible. So sentence number 2 corrects that particular error by bringing the subject as close to the modifier as possible. So a hard worker and a loyal team player. So who is a hard worker and a loyal team player? It's Sue. A hard worker and a loyal team player. Sue managed the new project. Sue managed the new project. So that brings more clarity as to who the sentence is referring to and who the subject of this particular sentence is. So the principle or the canon principle of modifiers is that the subject or the noun that is being modified should be as close to the modifier as possible. Ideally, it should be immediately after the comma, following the modifier, as is the case here. So more points to note. Some of these points we've already looked at previously, which, who, and whose signal noun modifiers, and that can signal noun or adverbial modifiers. And as we mentioned regarding that, we said that it is used for essential modifiers, that it is indispensable when used in a sentence, or if it should appear in a sentence, then you cannot drop it from that particular sentence. So where cannot modify a metaphorical place, such as a condition, situation, circumstance, or arrangement. In these cases, use which rather than where. So for example, it is wrong to say, we had an arrangement where he cooked and I cleaned. This is a situation. So, and as we said, by this particular principle, where cannot modify a situation. So the right way to phrase that particular sentence would be, we had an arrangement in which he cooked and I cleaned. So there are some of these nuances regarding the use of these markers and the use of modifier markers such as which, were, that, and it's very essential that you're able to know where they're used, in what circumstances they're used. So one canon principle regarding that, if a sentence calls for the use of that, then it is indispensable where it appears in a sentence. So maybe you had a sentence correction question that has that, and maybe some of the other answer choices omit that particular marker, then those answer choices are most probably wrong. Of course, there are other considerations to look if maybe the marker is used correctly, or if maybe there are other principles that trump the use of that particular principle. So of course, there is hierarchy when it comes to sentence correction principles, and you'd be best advised if you knew how to apply them correctly. So we're going to look at an example regarding the use of, or regarding misplaced modifiers, and how you can correct sentences that have misplaced modifiers. So we are going to look at this particular example. You can pause the video for maybe a minute as you look at it, and then I'll give the explanation shortly. Yeah, so I hope you've been able to probably pause the video and attempt this particular question. So we are going to look at it together. So as it is, let me just read through it, and then I'll discuss what is wrong or where the misplaced modifier error is. Of course, as you may know, or it'd be best advised to know that sentence correction errors do not occur in isolation. You find that sometimes you might find multiple errors occurring in a particular sentence. So your role or your goal would be to identify what errors are present, what is the severity of the error, and how do you best correct it. And the overarching principle in sentence correction questions is that you look for the answer choice that best corrects the error. You might find some of the answer choices are not maybe 100% grammatically right, or you might find some of them at times they might sound ambiguous, but the onus is upon you to look for the answer choice that is most grammatically correct, not 100% grammatically correct, but most grammatically correct. So in this case, we'll go through the sentence and see what's wrong with it. So the sentence reads, before its independence in 1947, Britain ruled in India as a colony, and they would relinquish power only after a long struggle by the native people. So there are a couple of things that are wrong with this particular sentence. And in the first case, or in this case, we are looking for a modifier error. So of course, that would be the error of first resort here. And your first task will be to identify the modifier. Ask yourself, what is the modifier in this particular sentence? And of course, your answer would be, it's the first dependent clause before the comma, before its independence in 1947. Once you've been able to identify the modifier, your next task would be, ask yourself, what is this particular modifier modifying, or what is the subject of this particular sentence? So before its independence in 1947, Britain ruled India as a colony, and they would relinquish power only after a long struggle by the native people. So of course, by logical extension or extrapolation, then you'd know that in this case, you have to identify the colonizer and the colony in this case. So of course, by logical extrapolation, Britain is the colonizer, India was a colony, right? So what you want here is that India should follow this particular comma that follows the modifier. As we said in the previous principle, you should place the subject of the sentence or the noun that is being modified as close to the modifier as possible. So once you've been able to identify that, then you'll be able to eliminate any answer choices that violate that particular principle. So the right answer choice should ideally have India following the comma here after the modifier. So you look at your answer choices by process of elimination. Of course, process of elimination is a very powerful tool when it comes to identifying these errors and being able to eliminate them. So you look at the answer choices, eliminate the ones that repeat whatever error that you've identified. In this case, the misplacement of the subject of the sentence, or the misplacement, the misplacement of the modifier. So A is of course repeats the question, the sentence as it is. So A is definitely incorrect. Then you look at B. B states, before independence in 1947, Britain had ruled India as a colony and relinquished power. Of course, again, the modifier here modifies Britain, right? Which is incorrect, as we discussed earlier. So B is also incorrect because of it has a modifier error. C says, before its independence in 1947, India was ruled by Britain as a colony, and they relinquished power only after a long struggle by the native people. C does correct the modifier error by placing India immediately after the modifier to show that India is the subject that's being modified, or the noun that is being modified. So, but look further down the equation or read on to see if there are any new errors that the answer choice introduces, or any latent errors that have not been corrected. So India was ruled by Britain as a colony, and they relinquished power. So in sentence correction, and maybe as we're going to discuss in subsequent videos, there's another principle that we call redundancy. So, and the principle of redundancy, essentially what it states is that if you can use fewer words to convey the same meaning than maybe the answer choice provides, then you can eliminate that answer choice on the basis of its redundant. So this principle here is called concision. You should be very concise in your writing, in your expressions, and even GMAT does test concision as a principle. So if a sentence or an answer choice uses more words than is necessary to convey meaning, then you can remove it, and that's the case here. This particular answer choice reads, before its independence in 1947, India was ruled by Britain as a colony. Of course, if India was ruled by Britain, then automatically it was Britain's colony, right? So then the use of the words here as a colony would be redundant, or they would be surplus to the requirements of conveying meaning in this particular sentence. So you can eliminate that on the basis of redundancy. Maybe you can just illustrate here that the principle here is redundancy, or lack of concision, essentially the same thing. And even if you aren't able to catch that particular error, there's another error in this particular sentence. If you look here, we have an ambiguous pronoun they here. As I mentioned earlier, some of these principles, they do not occur in isolation. You might find more than one principle or one error that is occurring in a sentence. In this case, we have 3 errors. We have redundancy, we have, of course, the modifier error has been corrected. Then we have the ambiguous pronoun here. We are going to look at ambiguous pronoun ambiguity later on. Essentially, what it entails is that this particular, or what that particular principle entails is that any pronoun used in a sentence should be clear as to what it's referring to. In this case, it's not clear what they is referring to because because we don't have a plural subject here. Both or a plural noun here. Both India and Britain are in singular, so there's no reason why we should use a plural pronoun there. So that's a pronoun error. You can eliminate C on that particular basis. D states, before independence in 1947, India had been ruled as a colony by Britain, which relinquished power only after long struggle by the native people. So you can look at that particular sentence and you look for whatever errors that occur there. So before independence in 1947, India had been ruled as a colony. So again, there's a problem with the redundancy here. India had been ruled as a colony. You know, that's repetitive, right? And essentially what redundancy is repeating meaning in a sentence. So if India had been ruled by Britain, then there's no reason of including as a colony, because now that would be essentially just repeating yourself. So you can eliminate D on the same principle of redundancy. So that leaves you only with E. So look at E and make sure that it is your correct answer for this particular sentence. So before independence in 1947, India had been a colony of the British, who relinquished power only after long struggle by the native people. So it does correct all the errors that occur in the original sentence and also that have been introduced by the other answer choices. First, of course, our error of consideration here was misplaced modifiers, and that is is well corrected in E, because it states we have our modifier here. Before independence in 1947, India, the principle was that the noun that is being referred to or the subject that's being referred to should follow immediately after the comma that separates the modifier from the rest of the sentence. And that is the case here because the noun India immediately follows the modifier. So before independence in 1947, India had been a colony of the British. So of course now, once you state of the British, now you introduce you change the focus of that particular sentence. Now that shifts from that person to now from an inanimate country, which is Britain, as was used here, or as was used in the original sentence. Then now it comes to the aspect of now these are the British people and not the Britain, the country itself. And in that case, once you've introduced the aspect of the British as a people, then you can be able to use the pronoun who, and it will be clear that the pronoun who here is referring to the British people who relinquished power only after long struggle by the native people. Of course, the native people automatically, that would refer to the colonized people who are the Indian people in this case. So E corrects all the original error of the misplaced modifier, and it does not introduce any new errors, say of pronoun ambiguity or lack of pronoun agreement or lack of concision, as is the case with the other answer choices. And in this case, it will be your right answer. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope it's been clear as to the modifiers and what they all entail. We look forward to seeing you in the training and being able to explore this particular topic and others to a greater extent. So kindly join us for GMAT training classes so that you're able to get more insights and more pointers as to GMAT verbal and other aspects of GMAT in our training program. Thank you.
You've been watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, brought to you by Upstack America. Come back next time to hear more steps and missteps that I took on the path to becoming a successful immigrant in USA. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn.